Warm welcome to all of you who are joining us from wherever you are joining us. And a warm welcome to this Christian Heritage webinar, Sanctifying Reason, Isaac Watts as Enlightenment hymn writer. It's a huge delight to be joined by Beynon. And just a few matters of interest concerning the webinar tonight. Firstly, our format. We're going to be hearing from Graham for the first 45 minutes or so on the life and thought of Isaac Watts. And then there will be time for Q&A as well after that. And if you just look at your webinar screen, you'll see there's a chat function. And if you have any issues along the way, feel free to direct a message, a private message to me. I'm listed as Christian Heritage this evening, or to my colleague John Savage, who you should also be able to see, and we'll do our best to help. For questions, we will be sort of going through the presentation, then having a session of Q&A, but feel free as we go along, if it's helpful, to begin to register your questions. You'll see that there is a Q&A tab as well along the bottom that you can use for that. And if you think a question is particularly on point, you can upvote that question that's been asked by someone else. So feel free to do that. Just by way of general introduction, Christian Heritage has long run Round Church Talks. And Round Church Talks are really an effort to dig deeper into that really rich theme, which is the intersection of Christian faith and culture, both history and contemporary culture, to see how the Christian faith speaks in a living way to the issues we grapple with. So this is an extension of that. We would love to invite you to the Round Church, and I put a picture of it behind me just so that anyone who's longing to see the interior can can see it. We love to mill around and chat afterwards and share wine and nibbles, but unfortunately, of course, that won't be possible tonight. But thank you for joining us anyway. It's really wonderful to have you with us. To briefly introduce Graham. Graham Beynon has a background in science. He worked for a number of years as an audiological scientist, helping people with balance and hearing disorders. He's also worked for a number of decades in pastoral ministry. He currently leads Grace Church in Arbury in North Cambridge. And he also teaches at Oak Hill Theological College, leading and directing their program of independent studies. As well as that, Graham has a doctorate from the University of St Andrews, looking at the life and the thought of Isaac Watts. And we're going to be benefiting from some of the fruit of that study this evening, which is wonderful. Just to also let you know that Graham's work on Isaac Watts is available. There's a more academic volume of his thesis from T&T Clark. And then there's Isaac Watts, His Life and Thought, which is available, is it from Christian Focus, Graham?
Right, yeah.
From Christian Focus, and that's a more popular level exposition of Isaac Watts's life and thought. So just to let you know about that, before we begin, we're very much looking forward, Graham, to what you have to say this evening, and I'll hand over to you. A warm welcome from us.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be with you. Just if you're seriously thinking about the books at all, to say that the one from Christian Focus, the popular level one, is probably reasonably priced. The one from T&T Clark, my monograph from my thesis, will set you back the very reasonable sum of about £90. So you may not want to bother with that. So I'd like to talk you through Isaac Watts as an Enlightenment hymn writer. That was the topic, the heading that we came up with. What I want to do is tell you briefly about his life. I'm not assuming you know anything about him particularly, so just a very quick overview. We'll think about his discussion of the use of reason and how he responds to the Enlightenment. And we'll illustrate some of that from some of his hymns, and then look at his hymn writing in particular. That's what he's most famous for. So Watts was born in 1674. He grew up in Southampton, That's not his house, but that is a house that would have existed on the street where he grew up. He was part of what was called a congregational church. It was actually illegal at the time, and his father, in fact, was imprisoned for being a deacon at that church. He was very bright. By his mid-teens, he knew Latin, French, Greek, and Hebrew. And as he grew, his poetic ability became clear at an early age. So, for example, he wrote what's called an acrostic poem. You see it says at the top, acrostic petitions. It's a prayer written in a poetic form using his name down the left-hand side to start the sentences. Let me just read it. Immortal God in persons three, sweetly convey thy grace to me. Aid me with wisdom from above and compass me about with love. Cover my failings, blessed Jehovah. Wash off my sins, make clean my heart, and righteousness to me impart. Teach me to understand aright thy sacred word, and with delight shall I peruse it day and night. Well, apparently he wrote that when he was 6. I'd be quite happy now myself. And I guess you see in that both a personal, fervent religion, but also an ability in poetry. He was actually offered a scholarship at either Oxford or Cambridge, which were the only 2 English universities of the day, but that would have required becoming an Anglican, conforming to the national church. And he declined. He studied at what was called a dissenting academy for those who dissented from the Church of England. He was a tutor to a well-to-do family and then a pastor of a church in London, a road called Mark Lane, now in the city. And while he was a pastor, he published quite a number of books. I'll just mention a few quickly to give you a flavour, and I'll come back to some of the more significant. The first book was actually on poetry, but then next to that you see a book on logic. That actually became a standard textbook at Oxford and Cambridge and Yale. And just in those 2 books, you get a shot of Isaac Watts. And what I think is so interesting about him, he's a poet. He has an artistic side, creative side, if you like. But then he wrote on logic. He wrote a great textbook on logic, use of the mind, rationality. And I think that combination of the 2, the artistic and the rational, is one thing that makes him a very interesting topic. He wrote theological works, so works on prayer, for example, and then one called On the Love of God, there on the use of the passions or the emotions. And I'm going to come back to that work in a moment, but wrote on a number of other theological topics. Most famously, he wrote his hymns. He's called the father of English hymnody. He wasn't actually the first to write what we know of as the modern hymn, but so others had done it before him, but he certainly kind of contributed massively. No one had written as much or as well, and so he really changed the hymn singing in this country. He also wrote children's songs. You see that one next to it. That book actually was one of the best sellers of the 18th century. It sold over 7 million copies, which, given the population and so on, was incredible. He suffered from significant illness during his life, had various times of absence from his church. He remained pastor there until his death in 1784, and was buried in a place called Bunhill Fields, which is a cemetery in London. He's remembered with statues where he grew up in Southampton. And in fact, the town hall in Southampton plays one of his hymns every 4 hours or something, I think. The statues in a park in Stoke Newington, where he lived in London, a bust in Westminster Abbey, and so on. So he really made something of a mark. Now let's think about Watts's times. And I just want to sketch some of the background to set what's in place here. But the early 18th century saw the rise of reason, the Enlightenment. There was scientific progress through Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle and others. In the 17th century, the founding of the Royal Society. And most significantly, through that and other writers, rapid growth in the confidence people had in the use of reason to discover truth. And reason here was really used in contrast to some of the other sources of truth, tradition, religious dogma, mystical experience, and so on. And in comparison to those, people spoke about the clear, cool light of reason. And a key figure here is the philosopher John Locke, that you may have heard of. He wrote a famous work called Essay on Human Understanding, which was incredibly influential. Now, alongside that rise of reason, I've put the suspicion of passions, or we would say emotions. And passions were often seen to be kind of almost the opposite to that cool reason. When your passions were raised, when you felt strongly about something, you didn't think clearly. And Watts himself gave an analogy on this. He said, cool, calm reason was like a steady flowing river where the water was clear and you could see straight through it. But if you raised your passions, that was like stirring up the mud at the bottom, and the water became cloudy and you didn't see properly. Now that's a picture of the predominant thinking of his day, and the very fact that Watts gave that illustration tells you he basically agreed, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Too much passion made you what was called an enthusiast. That word's changed its meaning over time. Probably the equivalent today would be more like being a fanatic of some sort, and fanatics aren't reasonable. So overall, there was suspicion of passions. There was the rise of what would be thought of as early sentimentalist thought, which had a much more positive view of the passions, that the passions could guide us in what was right and how to live. But that was a minority view. There was still overall a suspicion of passion. And this had certain results in the life of society. Everyone went to church, but it had a result in, excuse me, I just pressed the wrong button, the cooling of religion. Sermons tended to focus on morality. Services were dry and dull. Preachers were concerned to show how reasonable they were, how logical they could be. William Hogarth actually has a sketch of a church service, which is entitled The Sleeping Congregation. And the minister is gazing at his book and clearly giving a very dry lecture, and everyone is fast asleep. There was also a rise in what's called natural theology. That is, we can find out all we need to know about God and life and everything from studying the world around us using reason. Reason will give us the answers. Some people then wondered, well, what do you do with the Bible if the Bible is supposed to be some kind of revelation from God? And some, in fact, said all that the Bible is a republishing of what we could know from nature. So very confident of what we could study using our reason and our observation, so much so that the Bible would simply confirm what we found. And then lastly, there's what I'd call reasonable religion. People were at pains to show that their beliefs were reasonable, that they fitted with this received thinking of the day. And that started to mean people were airbrushed out certain beliefs that might have seemed unreasonable. The Trinity, how God is three but one, or the atonement, Jesus dying in our place, the work of the Holy Spirit. Well, they all came under question and were either downplayed or in some cases denied. So that's the setting for Watts. So let's turn to Watts and reason. I've already indicated that he bought into much of the Enlightenment way of thinking. You see this early in his time at this dissenting academy I mentioned, the equivalent of university. He speaks about learning from Descartes and Boyle and Newton and Locke and so on. And he wrote a poem summarizing something of his learning. And there's the first stanza for you. It says, "Custom, that tyrannous of fools, that leads the learned round the schools in magic chains of forms and rules. Received wisdom, customs, just lead us round and round in our thought. There's no sense of progress." And that poem goes on to speak of his tutor, who was called Thomas Rowe. And it says this: "I love thy gentle influence, Rowe, thy gentle influence like the sun, only dissolves the frozen snow, then bids our thoughts like rivers flow and choose the channels where they run." Rowe, you see, had encouraged him and others to think for themselves. Let your thoughts run. Use your mind. In Watts's day, it was referred to as free thinking. And so from his time studying onwards, Watts was very positive about the use of the mind and using our reason to establish truth. He wrote works on the use of the mind. I've mentioned that one on logic. There was a follow-up called On the Improvement of the Mind, how to think better, how to reason well. He also wrote works interacting with John Locke, who I mentioned, who really was the father figure of rationality. Here's one of the things that he said. "He has proceeded to break our philosophical fetters and to give us farther release from the bondage of ancient authorities and maxims. I acknowledge the light and satisfaction which I have derived from many of his works." And you see again there the picture of being released from inherited tradition. In another place, he says this on Locke's most famous work: "His essay on the human understanding has diffused fairer light through the world in numerous areas of science and human life. There are many admirable chapters in that book, and many truths in them which are worthy of letters of gold." So very positive about Locke and the use of reason. And this is then seen in Watts's ministry and in his hymn writing. He follows Locke in saying that reason helps us to know what to believe. And he argues that it's completely reasonable to believe the Christian message. He says, for example, God has given us rational faculties and requires the exercise of them in religious concerns, and has laid down such grounds for faith in all ages as must approve itself unto reason. This is kind of employing Locke's framework. Locke said any proposition should only be accepted if it was based on being discovered by reason, or that reason kind of established its credentials, gave you a good reason to believe it. And Watts agrees and says people should have a good reason to believe things. Faith shouldn't be a step in the dark, a kind of blind leap. He argued why Christian beliefs were either reasonable, and I'll come back to that in a minute, or that reason established its credentials. And so he effectively argued for the veracity of the Bible and why you would believe what it said. He wanted people to know why they believed. He also wanted people to know exactly what they believed. In the Enlightenment, there was discussion of language and the need to say things clearly, precisely, to know what you were saying. And whatever you do, don't cover over things with kind of clever rhetoric which masks what you're really saying. Spit it out effectively. John Locke had this view and wrote on this. He wrote of what he referred to as clear and distinct ideas. An idea was a concept. And you had to have the concept clear in your mind, be able to picture it, know what it was, but also distinct, clear and distinct. Clear was knowing what it was. Distinct was recognizing how it was different to things that might be a bit like it. Now, imagine you've got to have a concept of what a particular model of car might look like, and you could sort of picture it. But if it was clear and distinct, you could also tell the difference between it and things that other cars that looked a little bit like it. And Watts echoes this, and he says, don't just be content with words as sort of labels. Know what you're saying. Be clear, be distinct. And this is then actually very influential in his hymn writing. He says he's worked very, very hard to be clear. He employs this clear and distinct ideas in his hymns. So at one point in describing writing his hymns, he says this: I have aimed at ease of numbers and smoothness of sound, and endeavoured to make the sense plain and obvious. If the verse appears so gentle and flowing as to incur the censure of feebleness, I may honestly affirm that sometimes it cost me labour to make it so. Some of the beauties of poesy are neglected and some wilfully defaced. So he's saying there, I've tried to make it clear and obvious, and if it might appear a little bit kind of trite, sort of obvious sometimes, so that you might not think it's very good poetry, he's saying, I worked really hard to make it like that because I wanted to make it really clear. And in fact, I may even have thrown out some of the beauties of poesy, that's poetry. So something may have been worked better poetically, but it wasn't as clear, and so I got rid of it. This was referred to in the day as the art of sinking your language to the level and the comprehension of your listener, and Watts believed in that. He did other things to help people's understanding. At the time, the way hymn singing would have worked was that a clerk at the front of church would have read out a line of the hymn, and then the congregation would have sung it back. Then he'd have read the next line and then sung that back. This is simply because they didn't have enough hymn books, printing was expensive, and a lot of people couldn't read. But actually that meant it takes quite a long time. It takes twice as long to get through a hymn. And if you think about it, it means if you start a verse of a hymn, it's quite a long time until you get to the last line. And so what Watts said was he was very concerned to make each line contain a thought, a complete thought, or that it was completed by the second line. Later on in hymn writing, some stanzas really only make sense by the time you get to the end, but Watts was worried people would have forgotten it by then because they had to line it out in this way. So he is an Enlightenment man in the use of reason. But he also argues for the limitation of reason. He both commends and critiques John Locke. He says reason is good and we should use it in all those ways I've mentioned, but it is limited because it is fallen. It is affected by the Christian doctrine of sin, of turning away from God. So here's one quote. The eye of the understanding is strangely blinded, and the judgment strangely perverted by the fall of man. We are led into false judgments of things by the corruptions of our minds, by the unhappy influence that present sensible things have over our whole nature. We are not as objective in our clear thinking as we would like to think. And of course, since the Enlightenment dawned, modern rationalism has actually been shown to have many presuppositions which affect the way it is used. Rationalism is a tool, but it's never an impartial tool. It's always angled in some way. And today we might speak about things like unconscious bias as well. We don't realize what presuppositions or prejudices we bring to our judgments. And Watts is effectively saying exactly that. Another illustration Watts gives, he says reason is like our eyes, and the truth say about God or life is an object that we're looking at with our eyes. And he says, you can't see anything without using your reason, just like we can't see anything without using our eyes. But he says we are blinded. We need to have the lights turned on so that we can see clearly. We need our eyes kind of corrected so that we can use them properly. And this is where he differed from Locke. Locke effectively said, you can decide whether to think about something, but it's as if you do end up thinking about it, you can't avoid the truth of what's in front of you. If you open your eyes, you can't deny it. Very strong kind of modern rationalist. And Watt says, no, we are much more complicated. We may not want to know the truth. In fact, we are unable to know the truth. There are examples of this in his hymns, actually. Here's one. The mysteries of redeeming grace are hidden from the wise, while pride and carnal reasonings join to swell and blind their eyes. So he refers to carnal reasoning there. He means reasoning affected by our sinfulness. He does believe that our sight, as it were, can be improved. Our reason can be sanctified and improved. But left to ourselves, we cannot see clearly. And so he argues we need revelation. We need God to tell us the truth. He says this, the revelation of God in an illustrious manner supplies the deficiencies of our reason and enlightens our natural darkness in the knowledge of divine things. Left to ourselves, our reason can't help us. We're in the dark. We need God to speak. And so he defends the need for revelation, the authority of the Bible, and against those who would say it was only a republication of what we could find out by our reason that I mentioned earlier. So in fact, he writes a poem about John Locke. He writes poems about a lot of people. Here's part of it. Reason could scarce sustain to see the Almighty One, the Eternal Three, or bear the infant deity. Scarce could her pride descend to own her Maker stooping from his throne and dressed in glories so unknown. A ransomed world, a bleeding God, and heaven appeased with flowing blood were themes too painful to be understood. Reason cannot see the truth about God in things like the Trinity or the Incarnation. It can't understand the themes of a ransomed world, a bleeding God, Jesus dying to save people. This also comes in his hymns. Almighty God, to thee be endless honours done, the undivided three and the mysterious one. Where reason fails with all her powers, there faith prevails and love adores. It's not that reason fails and that you just have to have faith. He doesn't believe in blind leaps, but reason would never have got you there by itself. So while he thought we can learn things from the world, he believed in that natural theology to some degree, we'd never understand the key truths, the most important things, unless God revealed it. One last hymn example on this. Nature with open volume stands to spread her Maker's praise abroad, and every labour of his hands shows something worthy of a God. Studying the world around us will tell us truth about God to some degree. But in the grace that rescued man, his brightest form of glory shines. Here on the cross 'tis fairest drawn in precious blood and crimson lines. It's in the revelation that comes through Jesus and the cross that we see God truly. This then leads to reason being sanctified. We've said it's blinded, but God shines his light. And he then can help us think clearly. He can kind of restore our faculties, as it were. And for Watts, this related to conversion and the work of the Holy Spirit in people to sort of renew them. So here's one quote. He said, "The Spirit works to reform our natures, to put all our misplaced and disjointed powers in their proper order again, and to maintain this divine harmony and peace. It is the blessed Spirit that inclines reason to submit to faith, and makes the lower faculties submit to reason and obey the will of our Maker, and then gives us the pleasure of it." The Spirit reorders our thinking and our feeling. And Watts would go on to speak about how Christians can and should employ their reason well in thinking as God intended. God made us as rational beings. But there was this kind of harmony and indeed pleasure that now came. Last comment on reason here before I move on to one last, a different area. Watts had said there had to be revelation, but he still had this strong belief in the reasonableness of the faith, and this leads him to kind of defend the reasonableness of the faith, and lots of his works actually revolve around this. So I've given you the heading of one there. It's called Ruin and Recovery, which is about the doctrines of sin and salvation, people's fall into ruin and God's recovery of them. It's one of the contested areas of the day. But it's the subtitle I want you to notice: An attempt to vindicate the scriptural account of these great events upon the plain principles of reason. In a culture that elevates reason, he says, let me show you these doctrines are perfectly reasonable. Let me vindicate the scriptural, the biblical account upon the principles of reason. He writes similar works on the Trinity and other areas. So he was what we would now call an apologist, a sort of a defender of the faith. But Watts, I think, fell into something of a danger here, and that is of elevating reason too highly. It's like I think some of his theory that I've tried to describe was okay. We use our reason, but we need God to sanctify it so we can think clearly. And he needs to still reveal things to us that are kind of beyond our reason. So his theory, I think, was pretty reasonable, if I can say that. But in any area of knowledge like this, you've got to think about what your tools are, or what the playing field is you're playing the game on. And see, what happened for Watts, I think my analysis is he leaned towards agreeing that you could just have reason as the tool in your hand, or reason was the field of play. So the whole game is played there. And so he bends over backwards to try and explain how reasonable these sorts of doctrines are. And he ends up with, unfortunately, some contortions, I think, bending them to fit. And so in some ways, I think his theory was right, but it's almost as if he couldn't quite hold himself to it. And in that sense, of course, we're all products of our own day, and he was very much a product of the Enlightenment, resisted lots of elements of it, countered elements of it, but I think in a couple of areas kind of gave in and ran with it. That's primarily his use of reason. I wanted to move, before we finish, to talk about how Watts reacted against Enlightenment thought in a second way. He did believe in Enlightenment reason, but he felt that thinking about reason alone was too kind of monochrome in looking at humanity. And so he also wrote on what they called the passions. In other words, kind of reducing us to kind of brains on legs, to sheer rationality. That reduced us. That didn't recognize the complexity of us. We're not logic machines. We are thinking, feeling, acting people. And those all get bundled together. Now, he was an Enlightenment thinker in the priority that he gave to reason, but he very quickly said we mustn't just think, we feel. So this work for example, discourses of the love of God. You see the subtitle there. The love of God, that is God's command to love him with our hearts, and its influence on all the passions, with a discourse of the right use and abuse of them in matters of religion. So, for example, in this, he goes on to say this: has he formed my soul to delight and love? And has he confined these sweet and pleasurable capacities only to be employed about creatures, when the Creator himself is supreme in loveliness? Will not this most amiable of beings expect that I should love him and give me leave to make him my delight? So he's saying we're formed to have all sorts of feelings, to love and delight in things, not just think about them. And so surely we should feel love and delight in the best of beings, which is God. Our heart should be warm towards him, should flow in love towards him. And in his day, of course, this meant he was in danger of being called an enthusiast, that he was becoming a bit fanatical and not just being cool and logical. And he says, in fact, I know I'll be accused of being an enthusiast, so be it. In this work I've mentioned, he wanted to vindicate the passionate Christian, to say it's okay to feel. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, this is, I think, what makes what's so interesting. He wants to vindicate the faith in logical terms and vindicate feeling. So he wants these clear and distinct ideas about the faith, and he wants warm hearts. And in fact, both of those show themselves in his hymns. I've mentioned the clear and distinct ideas already, but it is actually his concern about people's passions that drives his hymn writing. Let me give you his comment on the singing of his day. To see the dull indifference, the negligent and the thoughtless air that sits upon the faces of the whole assembly while the psalm is on their lips, might tempt even a charitable observer to suspect the fervency of inward religion, and 'tis much to be feared that the minds of most of the worshippers are absent or unpleasant. He's concerned about their minds, their thinking, but also about their fervency, their hearts. So he writes hymns in a way that people could clearly understand. And he feels like one of the problems actually is that people are only at the time singing psalms. There's a psalms from the Bible, from the Old Testament, and feels that they are too obscurely written. He thought the psalms were great, but he thought the hymns based on them were pretty terrible. And he wants them to be clearer to know people, so that people know what they're saying. And then he also wants people to feel. And so you get this combination of people singing with right understanding, and that a hymn would then be a vehicle to right feeling. So he says this of singing: let us remember that the very power of singing was given to human nature chiefly for this purpose, that our warmest affections of soul might break out into natural or divine melody, and that the tongue of the worshipper might express his own heart. People need to express their passions to God. And so he worried about praise and all forms of religious meetings, as it were, that was purely formal. He put this in one of his hymns. In vain we tune our formal songs, in vain we strive to rise. Hosannas languish on our tongues, and our devotion dies. And then goes on with a prayer for the Spirit to work to raise our passions. Come, Holy Spirit, heavenly dove, with all thy quickening powers. Come, shed abroad a Saviour's love, and that shall kindle ours, kindle fire in our heart. And he then, in his hymns, also guides the singer's emotions. An awful lot of hymns, while they'd expressed elements of emotion, they primarily were stating propositions. And what's included? Lots of propositions, lots of truth, in clear and distinct ideas, but also guided what people should be feeling by the lyrics that he wrote. So here are two examples. Speaking of a hymn on the cross, thus might I hide my blushing face while his dear cross appears, dissolve my heart in thankfulness and melt my eyes to tears. I should cry thinking of this. Or, conversely, now shall my inward joys arise and burst into a song. Almighty love inspires my heart and pleasure tunes my tongue. He was encouraging people to feel pleasure as they sang. So this is why Watts writes his hymns and why he writes them the way he writes them. And I think one of the things that makes them so good. He wants these clear and distinct ideas that people can understand immediately, but he then wants that understanding to flow into affection expressed in praise and flowing out into action in people's lives. And so while in Enlightenment terms, yes, he's buying into a lot of things, he's also both challenging it and adding to it. We can't just have clear thinking where God is concerned. We must also have warm hearts. Let me finish with a final example of Watts's hymn writing. It's probably his most famous hymn, although people will debate. It's about looking at the cross once more. Here's the first and the last verses. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were an offering far too small, love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. Simple, clear ideas, well expressed, but profound and heartfelt. So, Watts is an Enlightenment hymn writer, both in his approach and in his content, but he also critiques the Enlightenment and believes reason is affected by our sinfulness. It needs to be sanctified, and God needs to reveal himself to us. And reason by itself is not enough. We're not just logic thinkers. We're holistic beings. We need to think and feel and act. Let me pause there and hand back to Joshua.
Thank you ever so much, Graham, for a wonderful presentation. Normally at this point, I'd invite everyone to put their hands together to thank Graham. Unfortunately, we can't do that at this point, but we have got time for some question and answer. Just before we begin that, I wonder if I can jump in. I hope, yes, hope I can be heard. Graham, are you hearing me? All right.
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Wonderful, that's great. Graham, just wanted, in a sense, I suppose this question could elicit quite a long response, but in terms of other Christian thinkers, pastors, Christian statesmen who are responding to the Enlightenment around the same time, living in that world, particularly in terms of their responses to reason and also to emotional passions. How typical or atypical is Watts's contribution? I mean, you think of someone like Jonathan Edwards, similar time frame, overlapping with Watts, although in a different context, very keen again to show that the reasonableness of Christianity, and yet also finding a place for the religious affections. But where would you sort of place Watts in terms of other churchmen and theologians of his day and his response?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and it could be a very long answer, as you say. And it is, in fact, one of those things that's very difficult to judge in studying history, to judge a kind of where you can very easily sample the range of thought and quote certain people, but then knowing what the graph looks like, as it were, where the majority opinions are, because of course you don't know what the majority of people think, because they never write it down for you. As far as we can tell, so that's the big caveat. As far as we can tell, there were certainly others who thought like Watts. I could quote other people. Some people, as it were, if I could put it this way, to sort of to the right of him, who would be less positive about reason, less having bought into the Enlightenment less and having resisted it more. But then there would certainly be an awful lot of people to the left of him, if that's the right direction, who would have bought much more whole scale into the Enlightenment thought, and wouldn't have put in some of those checks and the but what that I was mentioning. So he wasn't alone, but was towards the right. Jonathan Edwards, you mentioned, obviously in New England rather than England. It's slightly later than Watts, but overlapping with him. In fact, Watts's hymns were introduced at Edwards Church while he was there. And there are some interesting similarities, quite a lot of differences between them. In fact, Edwards writes one work which critiques one of Watts's works. They're not quite on the same page in some theological areas, but some real similarities between them as well.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Graham. We've got one question here which I can answer. This is from Humphrey Gleave. I'd like to share this, Graham. Not sure how these things work, but I hope there's a record accessible. There will be. This is being recorded. We hope to get this up on YouTube as soon as possible, probably tomorrow. So that will be available. I just also encourage you, if you've got a question, please do feel free to ask it in the Q&A. We've got one from Ian Cooper. Why did hymn writing start so late in England, 200 years after Martin Luther?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. So the reference to Luther there is that Luther in the 16th century was writing hymns himself, and so the Lutheran tradition had hymn writing from then onwards. Well, again, tracking the reasons for these things isn't always easy, but the normal impression is that the great influence within the English church wasn't from Luther, but was from John Calvin. A number of English reformers spent time in Geneva, particularly during Mary's reign, because of persecution of those who are Protestants, and so they fled the country. Came back saying, we've seen what a reformed church really looks like, and one of those elements was psalm singing, and Calvin was very strong on only singing the psalms. That also connects to people's principles, as it were, of how you go about thinking, what do you put in a service? And a lot of the influential Puritans were arguing that we should only do what God has commanded us to do in our worship services, and thought then that he had commanded only the singing of the Psalms, and so it became wrong to sing anything else. Now that was a dominant view in a lot of the 17th century. In Anglicanism, there was what we might think of as more kind of performance music, choral music, and so on, but not corporate hymn singing. So that they were happy to add things to the Psalms. In Watts's circles, psalm singing would have just been normal and standard. Some people wrote small collections. A minister might write half a dozen hymns. Some 17th century ministers did, people like Richard Baxter, Benjamin Keach. But they were just small additions to psalm singing as the regular thing. And then Watts really broke the back of that because he wrote so many and they were so good. But even then, he was severely criticized by many people because of his breaking with psalm singing. In fact, one of his works is called On the Improvement of Psalmody, and it's a defense of why we shouldn't just sing the Psalms and why it's okay to compose new hymns today. But the very fact he had to write that shows you the kind of restriction that most people in his circles would have felt.
That's fascinating, Graham. Thank you so much. Again, just an encouragement. Feel free to type your questions in. If you don't, I'm going to ask Graham a couple more questions. So please do feel free to use the Q&A tab. Graham, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Again, we've lasted about 50 minutes before mentioning the pandemic, but I'm going to break that now. You quoted Isaac Watts in his expression of the great value of singing. You know, it makes external what is in our hearts toward the Creator, and sort of in the expression of it, it furthers that passion. You know, the pandemic places us in the very unusual position of having been directed to not sing. And I mean, one would hope that maybe causes us to develop a bit more of a serious theology of singing and reflect on it. Do you have any thoughts for us on the value of singing in church life, and you know, perhaps prompted by the seriousness with which many have responded to the prohibition of singing?
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting, isn't it? It's often when you lose something that you both start to appreciate it, but also, as you've already hinted, start to think about it. And I do worry that singing is one of those parts of church life that everyone kind of just expects, is used to. Some may enjoy it, some may not. You just get on with it. And there's a danger then of simply kind of just rolling along with it. If you happen to really like it, that's nice for you. If you don't, then you sort of put up with it. And I think we need a much more robust understanding of singing. And so some of Watts's quotes I just gave, I would agree with heartily in terms of why God has given us singing. It allows expression of truth in a different way to stating it propositionally in prose. You know, good words set to good music, played well and helpfully, those are the three criteria, allow me to express my feeling about that truth really well. Clunky words, you know, dull tune, or played badly so everyone's unsure, you know, well, we sort of stutter along. And so I think singing is a gift of God, and it's spoken of in the Bible in many places in terms of the place of music in worship of God, usually in combination with appropriate emotions. You know, sing joyfully to the Lord, and so on. Well, you can state your joy, but man, you can really express your joy better if you can sing it. So I think that's a really key part of church life. Watts would say, and I'd agree with him, that it aids us in both expressing our feelings, but also kind of in instigating them, in helping raise them. As we kind of meditate on that truth in song, we feel differently at the end than we did at the start. That should be something welcomed and is a blessing to us. And so not singing, I think, is a massive hindrance, and it's horrible. And I think it's something that we will kind of suffer from in different ways. But I do hope it would mean people think about it more, and at whatever point we can, appreciate it much more fully.
Absolutely. And that's really helpful. Got a couple of participants raising their hands. There is no way, sadly, or there may be a way to, I'm just discovering this, there is an allow to talk button. So I'm gonna venture this. We'll see if we can get our participants speaking. So Humphrey, I'm gonna allow you to talk. I'm gonna press that button.
He needs to unmute himself.
I think you're muted still, Humphrey. I'm not sure if you can hear us, Humphrey. Nope. Okay. Right. We'll move to Ranald. Ranald's raised his hand. Ranald, I'm hoping this works. Again, you're muted.
Yeah, well, Susan and I are here together. Joshua, can you hear us?
Great, we can hear you. Lovely.
Good. And Susan was wondering, what about Isaac? What's his life, family life? Could you tell us a bit about
because
that?
in my experience, Graham, him singing also moved from the church, I don't know at what point, to family and community. So actually thinking of the pandemic, or working with older people, which we are well into the category, is a great comfort to have hymns. Those of us who've had the canon of hymns, we don't even need a hymn book very often.
Yeah.
It's something which comes to us more than anything else,
Yep.
perhaps.
Yep, I agree to that.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me make a couple of quick comments. So in terms of Watts's family, he never married. He did apparently propose to one lady at one stage, but was turned down. I'm afraid, and was single the rest of his life. So he never married. He lived with a variety of other families. I think it was a lovely thing that he didn't just live by himself, and for a long time lived with a family called the Abneys, kind of a well-to-do family who lived in Stoke Newington. In fact, in the grounds of their house is what is now called Abney Park, and there's actually a statue of Watts there, and there's a place where Watts was known to go and sit and meditate and write and things in that park. So he lived there, and we have in his writings and others comments on times of kind of worship, or whatever a better term, within that family, where he would speak or relay some sermon or something, and when they would sing together. So there was family kind of devotion expressed in song. And I agree with you. I think families singing is a lovely thing. And as you say, for older people for whom hymns are, because particularly if they're good poetry, stays with you better. And I think Watts's, well, not all of Watts's hymns were good poetry, I'm afraid. A lot of them have been lost aren't included in the hymn books of today, and they shouldn't be because they weren't that good. But lots of them were fantastic, and as a result, stick with you in a really helpful way.
Yeah, well, I've certainly appreciated them myself.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ronald and Susan. I'm going to go to Humphrey now. Humphrey, I think, is back. So I am going to try and see. I didn't know you could do this. This is really, really quite wonderful. Humphrey, you should be able to talk now. Are you there, Humphrey? You may need to unmute.
Yeah, he's still being shown as muted.
I'm going to do what I can, but I don't think I can unmute you. If you can hit the unmute button at the bottom left, you should be able to talk. That's not quite happening for us. No, I don't think I can forcibly unmute you. I'm sorry about that. All right, we've just got a few more minutes. If there are any last questions for Graham, please feel free to put those through or to raise your hand. One last try, Humphrey. I don't know if you can unmute yourself on the bottom left. No, that's not happening, unfortunately. All right, well, Graham, thank you ever so much for such a wonderful, lively presentation, so insightful. It's certainly given me much food for thought, and also a desire to really go and find out more about Watts. Maybe one thing I'd like to ask is if our interest has been piqued by Watts, and we want to go and maybe could you give us some recommendations, both of his primary works? Is there a more accessible first thing to start with in reading, but also where would you go if you were to find a good place to immerse yourself in his hymns?
Oh, yes, thank you. In terms of reading Watts for yourself, I'm afraid actually very few of his works are republished today. And one reason for that is that an awful lot of them were really very tied to the issues of his day. And so never sort of made the grade as a kind of Christian classic, if you like. But a lot of them are available online in different forms. I think the one on the passions that I mentioned, which is entitled "On the Love of God," I think it's actually a great work and bears study today in a really helpful way. His Guide to Prayer is one of the few books that is still republished today, and there are different publishers have published it. Banner of Truth, I'm pretty sure, is one publisher that still has it in stock, and I think that's a great exploration. And all of these things are of their day, but I think still with some very, very enriching thought. In terms of his hymns, they are certainly all available online. If you just go do an appropriate Google search, you'll find repositories of them. As I say, a lot of them, weren't great. He wrote almost 600, but I think they really do bear study and meditation, even so. And then some of them really are classics. Most of those, I'm pretty sure, would be available online. Just to be aware with his hymns, his hymns fall into two categories. He wrote a book of hymns. It's divided into three topic areas, as it were. But there is his hymn book, and then he also wrote a book on the Psalms. So he wrote on the Psalms, wrote a version of the Psalms, if you like, but did so in an unusual way. He kind of updated them a lot. And what he saw as biblical themes that were fulfilled in Jesus, he would then follow that through. Just if people know any hymns, I'll give you one example. Psalm 72 is a prayer for King Solomon in the Old Testament, and that Solomon's reign would extend, everyone would bow to him, and so on. And Watts, of course, knew you can't sing a song about Solomon anymore. Jesus fulfills all kingship themes. So his version of Psalm 72 is Jesus shall reign where'er the sun does its successive journeys run. Joy to the world, what we often think of as a carol, is actually Watts's version of Psalm 96. So some of his hymns, as we think of them, are actually versions of Psalms. And I think it's fascinating reading the Psalm and then reading his hymn on it and seeing what he's done with it, if you see what I mean, in terms of making it more applicable to people today. Anyway, that's probably more than enough.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It combines perhaps the teacher in him with the hymn writer as well.
Yeah.
Perhaps good practice for any songwriters listening in. Ian Cooper's got another question. Who did the music for Watts? Did he write music himself?
Yeah, thank you. No, he didn't. He didn't write any tunes. And so he simply used, there are a variety of tunes around that were commonly used in his day. He slightly lamented how few they were, and they were virtually all of Watts's hymns. You may, if you look at them, you'll see what's either called short meter or long meter, 4 lines long. All the ones I quoted this evening are 4 lines long, pretty much. And that's because those were the standard meters of the day. And he didn't have the capacity, as it were, to play with that. He just had to fit with it. One, extra bit of interest, if you're interested. At that time, hymn tunes and the hymn lyrics were kind of 2 separate categories. and you simply chose which hymn you wanted to sing and then chose which tune you wanted to sing it to. And you might sing it to a different tune this week than last week. Whereas today, I think we all tend to think of hymns and tunes as kind of sort of married together, that they go with each other, as it were. And that really didn't happen until about the 19th century.
Fascinating. Thank you ever so much, Graham. I'm sure everyone in their living rooms or wherever they are is joining me in thanking you ever so much for tonight. It's been fascinating, and I look forward to going and doing some Google searches on the back of this event. This will be available, so if you want to share it with friends, that will be up on our YouTube channel very soon. This is an encouragement also to have a look at Graham and his writing. He's written on a wide variety of themes, not only on the life and thought of Isaac Watts, but he's written on the emotions, which I'm sure sort of borrows from his scholarship on this period. He's written on church planting and independent church ministry. So please do go and check out what Graham Beynon is doing. Just one final thing before we part company. Next week, at the same time, on Friday, this is October the 16th, will be the first installment of our autumn series of lectures with Andrew Fellows. Andrew's taking on the subject of humanity in Humanity Matters, Re-Enchanting Homo Sapiens. And it's going to take a number of weeks to go through the Christian vision of the human person and how it differs from other accounts that are available today. And it will be of interest, I'm sure, to skeptics who are thinking through these perennial questions and wondering what the Christian faith has to say to them, and also for Christians who are keen to see how to apply their faith in our current day and age. This year, of course, has brought issues of human dignity, both through the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, to the fore. So we're hoping this will be a good tool over the coming weeks, and hope to see many of you there. You can see the sign up link is on our events page at roundchurchcambridge.org. Thank you everyone for being with us. Thanks again, Graham, and have a good evening.